I'm hoping that this Indo-Pacific strategy kicks off a bigger discussion in the defense world that, look, we're stretched in so many ways, and there's other challenges like recruitment, retention, and all those things. But part of those challenges, I think, are also woven into the anemic state that we're at with our Canadian armed forces and the lack of capabilities that we have. So I think it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? If we build a much more robust and well-funded military to serve our purposes, potentially that might add some enthusiasm into recruitment and retention.
Hi, and thanks for tuning in to the CDA Institute's Expert Series. For this installment, we spoke with Jonathan Berkshire Miller about Canada's recently released and long-awaited Indo-Pacific strategy. Miller touches on what the strategy does well, what needs work, and potential action items and next steps. We also discussed Canada's core interests in the region and whether the document reflects those interests, the current state of Canada-China relations, the extent to which the CAF's role will be expanded in the region, and strengthening ties with ASEAN. Jonathan is an international affairs professional with expertise on security, defense, intelligence, and geo-economic issues in the Indo-Pacific. He has held a variety of positions in the private and public sector. Currently, he is a senior fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs. Jonathan, thanks once again for joining the CDA Institute. So I'd like to start off by asking what your initial impression is of the newly revealed Indo-Pacific strategy. Where do you think there could be more improvement? Are there any important aspects that are missing? And is there anything new in the document that has not been articulated before?
I think context is important here too. So, I think if you go back 3 or 5 years and the idea of what we saw in this document that just was released versus what I think where the government was standing, and generally Canada, I think on both sides of the aisle, I think we've come a long way. So, that's not to say that this is mission accomplished and that we, wave the flag and say, everything's done. We're good because there's a lot of work to be done. And, I would agree with some points, that my colleague Charles and others have mentioned that, there's details, the devil's always in the details, and we need to see how this will be implemented. Of course, that's the case. But I did want to just take that point to say this is an important sort of marker in a couple ways. Number one, for the Indo-Pacific, of course, but also just broadly in foreign policy terms. Canada doesn't do foreign policy very well in strategic terms. We don't produce documents as much as we should. We don't articulate our interests. So the fact that this sort of process could get to a point where, number one, we release something publicly, but also there is some, relatively clear articulation on some areas of what we stand for, what we care about. Even if you could debate some of those pillars, I think that's a positive sign that we're going in that direction, that we're articulating some of the things that are important to Canada and to Canadians. I do salute the people who worked really hard on this. This was a really heavy lift, this strategy. And I know a lot of people inside, outside of government put a lot of effort and attention to this. It is really a significant turning point for Canada. The last thing I would say, though, again, with all credit to everyone who's written this, the work starts now. And I think that's maybe the point I made at the beginning. Nothing has been accomplished at this point. It's great. It's excellent that they've worked and got the strategy out, but action in the end of the day is what matters. And we need to see these a lot of these pillars and these commitments put into action. And finally, not only do we need to see the action, but we need to learn. We need to come to terms with the fact that this is not a project. It's not 5 years, 10 years, Asia check. We've done that one. We're in for the long haul. And I know that the rhetoric mentioned that in the strategy, but the reality needs to match that too. We need to make sure that this is not seen as a deliverable of the day and gets forgotten. Think of the Americas strategies and others that we've thought of before, but this is serious business, and this will seriously impact the future prosperity and security of Canadians. So that's what I'm hoping for, and I'm also hoping there's a bipartisan nature on this too. There's always going to be disagreements about the details, but I think in a bipartisan way, both sides and all sides in Canada should accept that the Indo-Pacific is important for Canadians, and we need to pay significant attention to this, and this should continue regardless of what government's in power.
What are our core interests in the Indo-Pacific, and does the strategy appear compatible with them? Do you think the policy will contribute to our security, climate, and economic goals, as well as promote our interests and values in the region?
And I think we have a wide range of interests, but I mean, in general terms, I mean, obviously, we want to do things internationally that improve the security and defense of Canada, but also the prosperity of Canada and Canadians. So any strategy in very general terms should be guided by, obviously improving our security and enhancing our prosperity, while at the same time, ideally, pushing forward some of our values in an empathetic way. I should know, because we don't want to push it down people's throats, but at the same point, we should be cognizant that our values and those with our allies are important as well. So I think those are the guiding lights, obviously, that we should be thinking about. Within the sort of the interest basket, I think there's a lot of significant ones. Obviously, energy security, I think, is a big one. Agriculture. I mean, we are a superpower when it comes to agriculture. We probably could or should be a superpower when it comes to energy. I think we really need to realize our strengths, and it doesn't mean that we dismiss some of the other challenges that are associated with it, especially climate challenges. But I think we do need to clearly recognize that geopolitically, the globe is at a point in time where everyone is looking for safe and secure, reliable supplies, and it doesn't get more safe and secure than Canada. So I think Europeans are thinking this, obviously, with the war in Ukraine, but our partners in the Indo-Pacific are absolutely thinking this. I use the statistic to say that around 85 to 90% of energy that goes to our partners in South Korea and Japan comes from the Gulf. That doesn't seem sustainable in the long term. Any myriad of problems could challenge that. Whether it's instability in the South China Sea, whether it's instability in the Gulf itself. It seems like a precarious situation that they've placed themselves in. And I think they recognize that, and they recognize that Canada might be a potential avenue to mitigate those concerns. So energy is one, but one point I'll leave on this too. I mean, there's obviously, the conversation is too short to get into all of our interests, but one thing I liked about this strategy is that it did highlight, in some senses, our connection to the United States, which is an obvious one. But we're a North American nation, in addition to being a Pacific nation and a transatlantic nation and an Arctic nation. And we sometimes tend to forget that or downplay that or pretend that we want to escape our geography. But the reality is that we have a really fortunate geography in that sense. I mean, it doesn't mean we agree with the Americans on everything. But the reason I mentioned the American dynamic is that what happens in the Indo-Pacific as it pertains to the United States is almost existential for Canada as well. It will not be the same for Germany, what happens there versus Canada. If the United States is involved in some sort of significant competition, potentially conflict in this region, we're intimately involved, whether it's through our Five Eyes relationships or just the fact that we are right next to the United States, our trade dependency on the United States, et cetera. So I think understanding that, it doesn't mean we need to, mimic the Americans on all things China, but I think we do have to recognize that that's a reality for us. And I think the strategy, at least mentioned elements of that and was more forward-leaning on that than I had expected, to be honest. So I'm happy to see that.
The foreign ministry spokesperson for China had some strong words about the strategy, indicating that Beijing received it negatively. What reaction might we expect from China, considering the recent exchange between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Xi at the G20 summit? What does that interaction say more generally about the current state of Canada-China relations?
If you're looking, 3-4 months ago versus today, with the state of Canada-China relations, I think we're in a pretty similar place. I think the relationship was quite bad 3 to 4 months ago, and I think it remains, at that state. So I think, in those sort of micro scale terms, I think not a whole lot has changed. I think obviously the Chinese are not pleased with this strategy. I think that they see, being labeled a disruptive power. And, I think, to be honest, this on China, this strategy leans forward more than a lot of other countries' strategies on the Indo-Pacific. I mean, the Japanese and others, I mean, they don't directly take a couple pages to talk all about China and China's role. I mean, even though their strategy and many other strategies are all about China, the direct language on China being a disruptive player probably is only the only somewhat similarity might be parts of the United States' approach. So I think that the Chinese obviously look at this and be like, wow, any sort of quote unquote nuance that we had hoped, or a softer line, is not there. So that probably disappointed them. But and this is a reality that I've been saying for some time, is that those who I think thought we would maybe ping pong back to this hills and valley relationship with China, that we were in a big valley with the Michaels being detained and the 5G issue. I think that was really naive thinking. I often call this a trench rather than a valley. The structural issues around this relationship and around China's coercion, not just with us but with many of our friends, I think led to an awakening rather than just a natural up and down in the bilateral relationship. So I think that's sort of the direction that we're going in, and it doesn't mean that we don't engage with China or that we completely slice them out of Asia. That's just not realistic. But I think at the same point, we've finally come to the terms of the fact that they're a really disruptive power. And they've been a disruptive power to many of our friends in the region. So the meeting with Xi and Trudeau, I mean, from my sense, that sort of just reaffirms a lot of the views I had before, mainly that China, as they view Canada, sort of as the gum under your shoe type of approach. I mean, I think they just, they don't think a whole lot of us on these issues. I use the comparison to think, would Xi Jinping have done that same thing to the United States president, the Japanese prime minister, or perhaps a handful of others? I don't think so. Narendra Modi in India. I mean, there are certain levels of power that China would not do that to, but I think they see Canada in a similar boat to maybe Australia and some countries in Europe, where they don't feel like they have to tolerate any sort of dissent or pushback. So that didn't surprise me, but I think that's a good window into the state of the relationship right now.
Many have called for Canada to implement a pragmatic approach to China. Does this strategy appear pragmatic to you? And does this document appear as though it could provide a framework to balance cooperation and competition with Beijing?
I think it can be pragmatic. I mean, in the end of the day, diplomacy requires two dance parties if you're talking bilaterally, and China needs to engage too. So I think it's pragmatic in the sense that in order to have a pragmatic realistic policy going forward, you need to understand the realities of the situation and the partnership. So to me, this is finally being pragmatic in the sense, okay, we're recognizing what's there. There's no mention in the document saying we don't engage with China, or we can't engage with China, or that only on this topic. I mean, I think it's saying that we need to recognize the real challenges and risks here, and if we can find opportunities, there are areas internationally that we need to and should work with China on, climate and others. So I do think that from a Canadian perspective, it's pragmatic. The trick will be the Chinese view of this. I mean, I do believe the Chinese will see this as very much a containment sort of strategy. So they may respond, and we've seen this even in the way that they've dealt with the United States on certain issues, that they're not going to play ball on issues that we want to play ball on just because we think that's a quarantined area that is safe for us. I mean, they have bartered things such as climate change, for example, with the United States, and said, why should we talk on climate change with you if you're sending your Speaker of the House to Taiwan? So, I still think it's the right move for Canada, but I expect that the Chinese side in the short term anyways will basically freeze us out, like they've been freezing us out for the past 3 years.
To what extent will Canada boost its naval presence and strengthen the CAF's role in the Indo-Pacific? What impact do you think this might have on the region's security? Will these contributions be meaningful, and how would current recruitment and retention challenges impact them?
I think it's one of the more important parts of the announcement. I was a bit, I don't want to spend too much time talking about the rollout of the strategy because there's been a lot of challenges. But one of the disappointments obviously was not having Minister Anand there. I understand people are busy and have different schedules, but the reason I mention that is because I think defense is an important and big part of this strategy. And for too long, the way that we've approached this region has been really about investment and trade. And, it's important to have, Mary Yang and others there talking about those things. But there are real important ways that we can contribute in defense and security. And, frankly, we already have been in some ways. So a lot of it's highlighting some of the stuff that we've been doing, like Neon in the East China Sea, some of the submarine deployments in Southeast Asia, port visits, etc. In addition to the defense agreements that we're conducting with Japan, South Korea, and others. So there's things going on. There's more that could be done. And I think that's well thought about in the region, because I think our partners, they want a more balanced Canada. They don't expect Canada to be the United States Navy, or even the Japanese Navy, or the Indian Navy, or the Australian Navy. But they do expect Canada to at least be present in defense terms, and take part in more joint exercises, joint operations, and be just more empathetic on the defense and security issues that the region faces. So I do think that commitment, I think it's around 500 million, is positive. The one sort of caveat I'll put here, and I think you had a really good question on resources and feasibility, and that really is where the big question mark looms, because the intent is there, but this is not just working with what we have and getting more money for more visits. Frankly, we need more. And this is a bigger defense question, which the defense policy review, I think, will hopefully start to get the discussion going on it. But with our limited capabilities right now, we're a bit hamstrung. An additional frigate going to the Indo-Pacific is positive, but we need more frigates. We need more submarines. We need more of a naval presence generally. So this is not just a strategy question. I think this is definitely a procurement question, and a national defense allocation question that I think seriously needs to be discussed. Asia is one big part of it. It's not the only part. But I'm hoping that this Indo-Pacific strategy kicks off a bigger discussion in the defense world that, look, we're stretched in so many ways, and there's other challenges like recruitment, retention, and all those things. But part of those challenges, I think, are also woven into the anemic state that we're at with our Canadian Armed Forces, and the lack of capabilities that we have. So I think it's sort of a chicken and egg thing, right? If we build a much more robust and well-funded military to serve our purposes, potentially that might add some enthusiasm into recruitment and retention.
Does the new strategy address ASEAN? How will we increase our role in ASEAN? Some experts have claimed that talk about a rules-based international order does not necessarily resonate much with this region of the world. If there's any truth to this, what relationship should we seek to cultivate with the region?
Sort of three questions there.
Sure. Yeah, I think ASEAN is really crucial. Obviously, often you just need to look at a map of the Indo-Pacific, and the strategy, a strategic approach to Asia doesn't work without engaging with ASEAN. But that being said, one important element too, as we mentioned, ASEAN is a basic point, but an important point, that ASEAN is individual member states, 10 states, maybe an 11th is coming with Timor-Leste. So they all have individual perspectives on this region. So I do take the point that, of course, ASEAN, anyone who travels in the region there knows that ASEAN, not only doesn't want to choose between US and China, but effectively can't choose. Again, geography dictates, as geography dictates for Canada, geography also dictates some decisions for ASEAN states. That, though, is not the same as saying that the ASEAN states are not concerned about the behaviors of China and are wary of, the Indo-Pacific concept because they feel it's the Americans, coming in and containing China. A lot of the voices I hear in ASEAN, throughout ASEAN, are very enthusiastic about, elements of a more broader security engagement, from the US a bit, but also from other players like Japan, potentially Canada. And that's not to say that they just want that, but they do see a benefit in having more hands talking about security in the region, because frankly, they're concerned about the rise of China in this region. The South China Sea has effectively become a lake of China. They've been able to, ignore international law, militarize atolls, and effectively create an area that they can deny access to if they wish in the future. So ASEAN states are not naive. They've seen this, but they need to balance on it, obviously. So I think Canada needs to really, as it engages ASEAN, I think that the strategy has done some good things on this, and it was nice that some deliverables came out in ASEAN. But my big worry going forward is that we have some empathy and we listen to states in the region, especially in ASEAN. The partnerships with Japan and South Korea, especially, and Five Eyes, they're a bit easier because we see the Japanese in G7. We see the Aussies all the time in Five Eyes and other dynamics. We have a historic relationship with South Korea. The ASEAN relationships are still nascent in some ways. We've been a dialogue partner for a long time, but we really need to make sure that we just don't go into that region and say we're spending $500-600 million. Canada's here. Hope you enjoy it. I think we need to understand and ask them constantly, what's the Canada that you want, rather than just prescribing to them the Canada that we want to give. And, without getting into specifics of every deliverable, some of the things that came out in the strategy on ASEAN in particular, I feel like there was a bit of that doing what we want to do versus did anyone really ask the individual member states in ASEAN whether that's the 100 million or 200 million that will really help them. So there's time to adjust that and amend that and sort of make changes, but I think we just really need to be conscious of that point of not just flying into ASEAN capitals and talking about all the progressive values that we want to talk about and assuming that that's really going to address the challenges in that region, would be how I would refer to that question.